I spent an entire year of my life taking care of a woman who wasn't actually sick. Let me take you back to about 14 months ago. I was living in Chicago. I had a decent job, a small apartment I actually liked, and a life that finally felt like mine. I was 31 years old, and for the first time in a long time things were stable. Not perfect, but stable. And then my mother called. My name is Rachel. And my mother, Patricia, is one of those women who is very hard to explain to people who didn't grow up with her. She's charming and funny, and when she walks into a room, people notice. But growing up, that charm was mostly pointed outward, at friends, at boyfriends, at whoever she was trying to impress at the time. There were 4 serious relationships that I can remember before I turned 18, 2 of them involving men we actually moved cities for. There were girls' trips and weekend getaways and phases where she was really into something, painting, yoga, a man named Roberto who lasted about 8 months. She wasn't a bad mother. She fed me, she clothed me, she showed up for the things that really mattered. But she was absent in the way that's hardest to explain, present in the house, but not really there, her attention always slightly elsewhere, her eyes always looking towards something just outside our window. I left for college at 17, and I don't think either of us was particularly surprised when I didn't move back. We settled into a rhythm that worked for us: phone calls every couple of weeks, visits at Christmas, the occasional long weekend. It wasn't close, but it was comfortable. I had made peace with the kind of relationship we had. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I had just accepted that my mother and I were 2 people who loved each other from a careful distance. So when she called me that Thursday evening in October 2 years ago, I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of cooking dinner and her name on my screen felt like it always did, slightly complicated. But I picked up, and within 30 seconds I knew something was different. Her voice was quieter than usual. Smaller. She said she hadn't been feeling well for a few weeks, and that the doctor had found something and that she didn't want to make a big deal of it, but she thought I should know. My stomach dropped immediately. She said the word heart and something about monitoring and not being alone, and I stopped stirring whatever was on the stove and just stood there in my kitchen in Chicago listening to my mother sound, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely scared. I drove down to Cincinnati 3 days later. Her apartment was smaller than I remembered, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and someone else's cooking. She opened the door and she looked fine, physically. That was my first thought, and I immediately felt guilty for having it. She looked like my mother, same hair, same lipstick, same way of standing in a doorway like she was posing for something. But she seemed tired. And when she hugged me, she held on a little longer than usual, and something about that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't expecting. The first week, I told myself it was temporary. I'd stay for a week, maybe 2, make sure she was settled, set up some kind of system, and then go back to Chicago. But then the doctor's appointments started, and the medication schedule, and the days when she seemed genuinely exhausted and couldn't really manage on her own. And 2 weeks became a month, and a month became 3, and at some point I had negotiated working remotely and moved enough of my things down to Cincinnati that it stopped feeling like visiting and started feeling like living there. I want to be honest about something. Those months were not easy. My mother and I had never spent that much continuous time together in our adult lives, and there were days when the old frustrations came back like they'd never left, the way she made everything about herself. The way she could never just say thank you without adding something that slightly undercut it. The way she'd bring up old friends and old trips in a way that reminded me that her best memories had very little to do with me. There were nights I sat in her small spare bedroom and stared at the ceiling and wondered what exactly I was doing there and whether she would have done the same for me. But there were other moments too. Mornings when we sat at her kitchen table with coffee and she told me stories about her own childhood that I had never heard before. Evenings when we watched old films and she fell asleep on the couch and I covered her with a blanket and felt something soft and uncomplicated that I hadn't felt toward her since I was very small. We were building something, slowly and imperfectly, and I was starting to think that maybe this terrible situation was giving us something we had never had the chance to build before. I had been there for just over a year when everything fell apart. It was a Tuesday morning in late November. My mother had a scheduled call with her cardiologist, Dr. Ellison, who I had spoken to several times over the past year and who had always been warm and straightforward with me. The call was supposed to be a routine check-in. My mother took it in her bedroom with the door mostly closed, and I was in the kitchen making breakfast, not really paying attention. And then I heard it. Not the whole conversation. Just a fragment. Just enough. My mother's voice, low and a little nervous, saying, "She doesn't need to know everything, David. She just needs to think it's still serious." And then a pause. And then I know. But if she thinks I'm fine, she'll go back to Chicago, and I just can't let her leave yet. I stood completely still next to the stove with a spatula in my hand, and I stopped breathing. I don't know how long I stood there. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, but it felt like the floor had shifted under me, and I needed a moment to figure out which way was up. I heard my mother wrap up the call. I heard her say goodbye to Dr. Ellison in that light, easy way she had with people she wanted to like her. I heard the bedroom door open. And then she walked into the kitchen in her robe and slippers, saw me standing at the stove, and smiled. "Good morning, sweetheart. Is that eggs?" I looked at her. She didn't notice anything at first. She moved toward the coffee maker and reached for her mug, and I just stood there watching her. This woman I had rearranged my entire life for. This woman I had driven 300 miles for. This woman I had spent a year of my life worrying about and cooking for and sitting next to in waiting rooms, and I felt something rise up in me that I hadn't felt toward her in a very long time. "Who is that on the phone?" I asked. She didn't flinch. She poured her coffee and said, "Dr. Ellison," just the usual check-in without turning around, and the casualness of it, the ease of the lie, made everything worse. "What did he say?" "Oh, the same. Just monitoring things, nothing new." She turned around and looked at me, and something in my face must have shifted because her expression changed. "Just slightly. Just enough." "Rachel." "I heard you," I said. My voice came out very flat and very quiet, and I think that scared her more than if I had shouted. "I was right here, Mom." "I heard what you said to him." She put her mug down. The silence that followed was one of the longest I have ever sat inside. She stood on one side of the kitchen, and I stood on the other, and neither of us moved, and I watched her face go through about 6 different things in the space of 10 seconds, surprise, then calculation, then something that looked like it might be relief, and then finally, something I had almost never seen on my mother's face in my entire life. Shame. "How long?" I asked. She didn't pretend she didn't know what I meant. "The initial symptoms were real," she said quietly. "The first appointment, the first tests, those were real. But the results were better than I let on. Dr. Ellison said I was fine to manage on my own after the 3rd month. I didn't tell you that." "You didn't tell me that," I repeated. "Rachel." "I gave up my apartment," I said. "I have been working from your spare bedroom for a year. I canceled a trip I had been planning for 2 years. I have been driving you to appointments that you didn't need. I have been managing a medication schedule that I stopped because my voice was starting to do something I didn't want it to do." I put the spatula down on the counter very carefully. "Why? Just tell me why." She sat down at the kitchen table. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at it, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small I almost didn't recognize it as hers. "Because I knew you wouldn't come otherwise," she said. "Not for any real amount of time. You would have come for a weekend, maybe a week, and then you would have gone back to your life, and I would have been here, and everything would have gone back to exactly the way it was." She looked up at me. "And I couldn't stand the way it was anymore, Rachel. I couldn't stand talking to you for 20 minutes every 2 weeks and pretending that was enough. I couldn't stand being the person you called out of obligation. So you lied to me for a year." "Yes," she said. "Just that. No excuse wrapped around it, no softening. Just yes." I left the kitchen. I went to the spare bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at my suitcase in the corner, and I thought about packing it. I thought about getting in my car and driving back to Chicago without saying another word and letting her figure out what to do with what she had done. I sat there for a long time thinking about that. And then I thought about something else. I thought about every morning at that kitchen table, every film on the couch, every story I had never heard before about her childhood, about her own mother, about the girl she was before she became the complicated woman who raised me. I thought about the way she held on a little longer when she hugged me. I thought about how, underneath the manipulation and the selfishness and the breathtaking dishonesty of what she had done, there was something that was also just a mother who didn't know how to ask her daughter to stay. That didn't make it okay. I want to be clear about that. What she did was not okay, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. But I also knew my mother. I knew that asking for things had never been something she was capable of. I knew that vulnerability, for her, had always come out sideways, as a performance, as a manipulation, as anything except a straight line between what she felt and what she said. She had spent her whole life reaching for things indirectly because somewhere along the way she had learned that asking directly always ended in no. I went back to the kitchen. She was still sitting at the table exactly where I had left her, both hands around the mug, not looking up. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her look. She looked like someone waiting to be told to leave. I sat down across from her. "You should have just asked me," I said. She looked up. "I would have said no at first," I told her. "Probably. Because that's what we do, you and I. We keep each other at a distance because it's safer and we're both very good at it." I stopped for a second. "But you should have asked me anyway. You should have called me and said I'm lonely and I'm scared and I don't want to be here by myself anymore and I want my daughter. That's what you should have said." Her eyes filled up. My mother, who I had seen cry maybe 3 times in my entire life, sat at her kitchen table in her robe and slippers and her eyes filled up and she didn't try to stop it. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But I'm here." We sat there for a long time after that. We didn't fix everything that morning. You don't fix 30 years of distance over cold eggs and coffee. But we stayed at that table and we talked, really talked, in a way that we never quite had before, and at some point she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I didn't pull away. I did go back to Chicago eventually, but not that week. And when I left, I didn't leave the way I always had before, with that quiet relief of distance restored. I left with her standing in the doorway of her building, and I rolled down the window, and she said, "Call me when you get home," and I said, "I will," and I meant it. And I did.